You don't forget the sound of your own name being mispronounced during a $200 million compliance briefing. Karen, Max drawled like he'd only ever seen it written on an invoice he hadn't paid. Let's not bore the room with all that legalese mumbo-jumbo, yeah? The room chuckled. I didn't. My name's Karen, not the help, and certainly not optional when you're dancing with the Department of Defense in heels and a clearance badge. 4 years ago, under Harold, the original CEO, I could have slapped a clause from Title 48 on the table and he'd nod, grunt, and say, if you say it's required, it's required. Harold wasn't warm. He called his grandkids little tax deductions. But he knew one thing, the only thing standing between our firm and $1 million audit was me, a binder, and a red pen. I didn't do flashy. I didn't give pep talks. I read the clauses no one else dared highlight, tracked export control down to the comma, and kept us off every naughty list Uncle Sam ever drafted. That world? It ended the second Max showed up in his rented charisma and startup buzzwords. Max, the founder's only son, back from consulting in Zurich, whatever the hell that means when your resume's just a LinkedIn headline and a headshot with too much jawline, was suddenly interim CEO. A job title padded with interim and ego, no clue where the emergency server backups were stored, and less idea what a key personnel clause even was. Quick pause if this story already feels like your office, your life, your Tuesday. Consider hitting that subscribe button and tossing us a like. Helps the team out more than a catered lunch that HR swears counts as morale boosting. Let's keep going. First week of Max's reign, he declared modernization starts with mindset. Second week, he brought in a digital transformation consultant who thought Gantt charts were a form of abstract art. By week 3, he started calling compliance optional bureaucracy. I was told I might find more value focusing on back-end workflows, which is rich coming from someone who thought SOC was a type of footwear. And I noticed it. The shift. No more weekly check-ins. I access to federal audit portals, downgraded pending review. Legal stopped looping me in on updates. Hell, I wasn't even invited to the contractor milestone dinner. The same one I wrote the contract for. They sat around drinking overpriced Chardonnay while I reviewed a 20-page annex on breach scenarios alone in my office, reheating leftover tie and wondering when I became invisible. But invisibility has its uses. You stop being watched. You get time to look closer. That's when I noticed it, the subtle differences. Updates in the clearance logs that didn't track. Export forms filed late retroactively. Some authorizations missing signatures entirely. I flagged it. Sent it up the ladder, heard nothing back, so I made copies, quietly, thoroughly, labeled every page like I was prepping for deposition instead of another ignored compliance call. Max, meanwhile, was basking in his own spotlight, strutted through the office like he was on a homecoming court he bought with investor cash. He launched a Slack channel called #FreshIdeas and suggested we replace our risk mitigation flowchart with emojis. Legal tried to push back briefly. Then they got the memo, align or be reassigned. I wasn't scared. I was irritated. There's a difference. Max treated the federal contract like a pitch deck, like it needed sizzle. But contracts like ours don't want sizzle. They want acronyms, filings, personnel accountability, and a blood oath that your background check clears higher than a senator's. Max had no idea that removing me wasn't just a bad idea. It was a thermonuclear idiocy wrapped in arrogance and sprinkled with HR compliance violations. Still, I stayed quiet. Not out of cowardice, out of calculation. I needed to see how far he'd push, and if he'd be dumb enough to do it in front of the one audience that mattered more than any boardroom ego trip ever could. The federal client. And wouldn't you know it, he was. Max's big reveal came on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that smells like printer toner and existential dread. He stood in front of the whole leadership team wearing a smug grin and a hoodie with the company logo he had clearly redesigned in Canva. Behind him, slideshow flashed the title, Operation Next Horizon, Reimagine, Reinvent, Reduce. I'd seen better slogans on bathroom air fresheners. We're cutting legacy drag, he announced like he was narrating a spaceship launch instead of gutting a firm held together by old-school grit and government protocol. The future is agile, and agility means removing bureaucratic ballast. That word, ballast. Like I was some sandbag keeping his hot air ego from soaring. Within 48 hours, the consultants arrived. Airdropped in like corporate missionaries with ring lights and vague job titles. Change architect, workflow optimizer, compliance streamliner. One of them, fresh out of Wharton or a YouTube ad, asked me how many touch points we had with the federal client. I said roughly 7,000. It's called a contract. He blinked, but like, do they even read all that? I sipped my coffee and smiled. God, I hope so. Meetings started vanishing from my calendar. First, it was the strategy syncs, then vendor calls, then even the pre-audit briefings. I was told my unique skill set was being reallocated toward operational integrity, which apparently meant I was now proofreading reports no one asked me to write. One day, I tried dialing into the milestone roadmap meeting. My access code was revoked. Just a polite message from IT, per new access protocols. This resource is not available to your role. Like hell it isn't, I thought. I built that roadmap. I was that protocol. I asked legal if there'd been a reorg. They gave me HR's extension. HR told me to stay flexible in evolving team environments. That's when I realized this wasn't a restructuring, it was an exorcism. I was being quietly erased, pixel by pixel. Still, I stayed quiet, not because I'd rolled over, because I'd seen men like Max before. When I worked at the Pentagon, they used to waltz in with buzzwords and swagger, ignoring decades of institutional memory like it was mold on a sandwich. But those men, they didn't last. They flamed out, flailed upward, or landed in think tanks writing op-eds about how we failed to adapt. So I documented, quietly. My home scanner saw more action that month than the entire mailroom. I started triple archiving contract versions, time-stamping audit trails, screen capturing red-lined revisions. Not for revenge, for insurance. I knew Max's kind didn't just sink ships. They blamed the crew while lighting the matches. Then one Thursday morning, while I was cataloging Clause 14.7 revisions, a new email slid into my inbox. The sender, the lead contract officer from our federal client. Subject line, clarification. Inside, just one sentence, will you still be attending the upcoming milestone presentation? No greeting, no signature, no CCs, just that sentence like a pin pulled from a grenade. I read it 5 times, they knew something was off. Maybe they'd seen the org chart shuffle. Maybe Max had flapped his gums in a vision session. Maybe they'd noticed the new faces flooding their inbox without any security clearance codes. But this was them knocking softly before flipping the table. I hovered over the reply button. I could have written a manifesto. Could have attached the archived clearance log, the flagged audit errors, the entire list of modernizations that violated at least 3 sections of our MSA. Instead, I just closed my laptop. Not out of defeat, out of restraint. Because if the client was asking me whether I was attending, it meant they were already questioning him. And the last thing you do when your enemy is lighting the fuse? You let them. You sit back. And you let them forget you're still holding the detonator. There's a peculiar silence that falls right before a career implodes. Not the kind that screams or slams doors, but the kind you hear in a conference room when every executive's breathing is synced to the hum of the HVAC and no one dares blink. That's the silence I stood in. Milestone presentation was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. sharp. Federal client, internal leads, legal, ops, risk, all present. We were streaming from 2 cities, 3 time zones, and 1 very expensive contractor portal. The kind of meeting where showing up with the wrong badge used to trigger security alerts. Where I once had to stop a session because someone said NSA over Zoom without encrypted credentials. I was mid-slide. Section 6, Annex F. Compliance milestones met. Risk mitigations in progress. On screen, a chart showing export control audit flags, each one documented, dated, and cleared. That's when Max leaned forward. Sorry, just gonna jump in here, he said, all charm and shark teeth. Karen's done a fantastic job laying the groundwork. Really, let's give her a round of applause for her past work. I didn't move. No one clapped. He smiled tighter, that said. We're pivoting to a more agile compliance model. Less paperwork, more velocity. We think that aligns better with where federal priorities are headed, don't you? The client didn't respond. Neither did legal. I could feel the attorney from procurement actually stop breathing. Max turned to me like a magician finishing a trick. Karen, you're welcome to stay on in an advisory capacity during the transition. But as of today, we'll be going in a different direction. There it was. Fired me? Mid-sentence, in front of the client, on a federally recorded call. No HR, no offboarding packet, just a warm public thank you and the professional equivalent of a push broom to the ribs. I didn't ask questions, didn't raise my voice, didn't say a single thing. I closed my laptop. Not a slam, just a soft click that somehow echoed in the room louder than any scream. Then I slid the USB with the full milestone packet into my leather folder, stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and walked out without a word. Behind me, chairs creaked. You could practically hear legal's ulcer forming in real time. The federal client, the same man I'd walked through a hurricane of audits with, who once called me from a layover in Qatar to confirm one clause in a cybersecurity addendum, remained stone-faced. Didn't blink when I was cut off. Didn't flinch when I stood. But as I reached the door, I heard the scrape of his chair. He stood, said nothing. Just gathered his notes, picked up his water bottle, and walked out after me. Didn't glance at Max, didn't log off the call, just followed. We walked in silence down the hallway. I didn't ask where he was going. He didn't ask where I was headed. It felt like 2 people leaving a funeral, his expression unreadable, mine buried under years of practiced corporate composure. When we reached the elevators, he pressed the button, looked straight ahead, and said your slide was flagged as required in our internal prep. Annex F, I nodded, it still is. The doors opened, he stepped in. I didn't. As they closed, he turned just slightly and said, understood. Back upstairs, Max was probably high-fiving some consultant named Blaine, already drafting a LinkedIn post about streamlining legacy structures. What he didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to fathom, was that he hadn't just cut a roll. He just severed the one name tied to the contract's compliance validity. The literal human linchpin holding our federal clearance in place. But I didn't rush to explain. I let the doors close. Let the silence settle, because the fuse had been lit, and the building was still full. The echo of that meeting hung in the building like the smell of burnt coffee, bitter, wrong, impossible to ignore. By 10:07 a.m., the hallway outside the conference room was a graveyard of confusion. Max strutted out like he'd just executed a flawless coup. "We're moving fast now," he told one of the consultants, slapping his back like they'd just closed Series B funding instead of torpedoing a federally regulated contract. Old systems don't scale. Meanwhile, the rest of the leadership team sat frozen around a half-finished fruit platter and the smoking crater of a catastrophic decision. The federal client never returned to the call. No goodbye, no thanks for your time. Just one chair left conspicuously empty and a login that read connection lost, but everyone knew it wasn't a tech issue. People whispered. Legal held an emergency huddle behind closed doors. Procurement started cross-referencing the milestone submission schedule like they were trying to solve a murder with only a spreadsheet and a bottle of Advil. I knew because Jenna from legal texted me exactly that. "What the hell just happened? You okay?" I didn't answer, not yet. Max was too busy to notice the tension. He was busy dictating his version of events to the PR rep. "We've streamlined," he said. Karen was vital, past tense, but we're building a more flexible compliance narrative. A narrative, not a policy, not a clearance, a damn story. They were already drafting the press release, some jargon-filled swill about forward motion, agile restructuring, and legacy optimization. None of them realized yet that the real story wasn't being written by PR. It was already being composed in the federal agency's logs. At 2:42 p.m., while Max was still in meetings about branding the transition, I got a secure Proton Mail notification on my phone. Government domain. No greeting. Just a single line, off the record. "What's your availability next month?" I stared at it for a moment, sitting alone in my kitchen, coffee cold, binder still zipped tight beside me. That line told me everything they knew. Not just that I'd been cut, but what it meant, what it jeopardized. Max might have been playing musical chairs with department heads and legacy titles, but the client had one thing on their mind, continuity. And I was the continuity. My name on paper, on clause, on clearance. I was the signature that made compliance valid. The person who could legally sign off on handling restricted datasets, who had sat through the background checks, the psych evals, the 3-hour quarterly audits that Max couldn't even spell. I clicked reply, typed only one sentence. Depends who still has clearance. Then I shut my laptop again. Outside, Max was still marching forward like a man holding a map to a building that was already on fire. He didn't understand how any of it worked. Didn't understand that I was the named officer. Didn't know that Clause 9.4 in the MSA locked certain responsibilities to specific personnel, non-transferable, non-replaceable without written federal approval. Didn't know that the contract he just butchered like it was a pitch deck for a VC meeting didn't belong to the company. It belonged to me. By Friday morning, I stopped receiving internal emails. Access to the company drive? Gone. Key fob deactivated. Benefits page, your credentials are no longer valid, but I wasn't worried. Because silence is only terrifying when you don't know what's coming. I did, and I'd already laid the wires, the paper trail, the logs, the archived emails, the original signed versions, the flagged compliance slips they tried to streamline into oblivion. I'd backed it all up, stored in 2 places, one with my lawyer, the other already in the cloud folder I'd shared with the client 6 months ago for redundancy. The kind of redundancy Max just cut without blinking. And now it was just a matter of waiting. Let the building hum with confusion. Let Max spin his story. Let them all wonder where the storm was coming from, because it wasn't coming. It had already arrived. 3 months before Max's little TED Talk cosplay in the conference room, I was buried under a mound of export documentation so dense it could have legally been classified as geological sediment. I remember it clearly because that's when the first error popped up. Clearance log, May 3rd. Document ID 4887F, labeled Compliance Verification Annex G, supposed to have my sign-off. It didn't. Instead, it was stamped with the initials of a contractor named Evan, who once asked me what ITER stood for like it was a Pokemon. At first, I thought it was a glitch, a clerical fumble, something innocuous, until it happened again. May 8th, May 15th, June 2nd. Random initials, missing timestamps, backdated access logs. Someone was doctoring entries, or worse, automating them to skip the approval flow entirely. Dangerous enough on its own. Criminally negligent if discovered during a federal review, so I flagged it. Emailed legal, attached screenshots, bullet-pointed the anomalies. Even color-coded them for maximum readability because I'm a professional, not a vigilante. Crickets. A week later, I escalated to risk. The response, we'll circle back once the reorg dust settles. Translation, shut up and don't rock the yacht Max just bought. So I did what I always do when the walls start leaking and everyone pretends it's just condensation. I documented, I printed, I archived, I watermarked. I compiled a version-controlled backup of every discrepancy and had them notarized. 1 copy in my home safe, 1 in my lawyer's office. 1 uploaded to an encrypted cloud server under a name that would mean nothing to anyone without knowing the exact 5-letter acronym buried on page 27 of our Master Services Agreement. And just in case someone decided to get clever, I had a second binder labeled "If I'm hit by a bus," which I jokingly kept next to my cat's flea medication. But I wasn't just protecting myself. I was setting a trap, because I knew Max didn't read contracts. He skimmed headlines. He thought named officer was a ceremonial title, like best dressed or most likely to be deposed. Which is why, during the last contract renewal 6 months prior, I asked the federal client to add one tiny update. Nothing major, just an edit to section 4.1.3, named compliance officer must be explicitly listed, non-transferable without pre-authorization, and hold active top-secret clearance through all operational phases. They added it. Signed, sealed, accepted. And the name on the line? Karen Elizabeth Monroe. So the morning after Max's public decapitation of my career, I called my lawyer, the same woman who once helped me enforce a non-compete so vicious the guy moved to Guam. She answered on the first ring. Tell me he didn't. He did. Pause. What's your clearance status? That's why I'm calling, I said. I need confirmation. Is my named clearance still active? She didn't even hesitate. Fully intact. No revocation order. You're still the binding compliance officer for contract ID 94BND12 through next quarter. I didn't smile. Not outwardly, but internally. I was already seeing the headlines Max didn't know he'd written. By noon, a quiet update landed in the federal agency's procurement portal. Payment for milestone Q422 is held pending personnel compliance continuity review. In English, no check until they verified who the hell was holding the pen. And spoiler alert, it wasn't Evan. Inside the firm, things were starting to wobble. Legal started forwarding memos with subject lines like clarification request and urgent designation discrepancy. Finance was doing quiet cartwheels over the frozen invoice. And Max, he still didn't get it. He was too busy setting up a webinar about leadership through disruption to notice that the foundation he was standing on had started to rot. See, Max thought the rulebook was optional. He just didn't realize I wrote half of it. And I wasn't done yet. The federal client didn't send flowers. They sent a formal notice. Subject line, suspension of engagement immediate. 3 bullet points. No fluff, no emotion. Just bureaucratic steel sharpened to a razor's edge. All scheduled meetings are suspended until further notice. Outstanding invoices will not be processed pending internal review. Personnel breach under active investigation. Compliance status unresolved. I read the email on my phone from a corner booth at a quiet cafe 2 blocks off DuPont Circle. My tea had just arrived. The server offered lemon. I declined. Across from me sat a recruiter from a subcontractor that handled Tier 2 cybersecurity for the same federal agency. We weren't strangers. We'd crossed paths during a multi-agency audit 2 years ago and bonded over the shared trauma of watching someone mislabel a data container and then argue about it for 47 minutes. Today, she slid an NDA across the table. Just formality, she said. I didn't speak. I signed. Back at my old firm, the earth was shifting. Legal was in freefall. Procurement had gone silent. Finance was rereading every line item in the SOW trying to decode where the cracks started. And Max was doing what men like him always do when their reflection starts to blur. He blamed everyone else. First, it was the outdated contract structure. Then it was legal's lack of urgency. Then it was compliance's inflexibility. He paced the glass hallway like a peacock with a thorn in its foot, red in the face, jabbing fingers at department heads and demanding answers he didn't understand. At one point, he stormed into legal's office shouting, "Why didn't anyone tell me she was named on the damn thing?" Jenna, bless her, didn't even look up from her laptop. You said you didn't have time for the boring sections. HR tried calling me 4 times that day. Then sent an email titled, "Touching base, would love to chat." I didn't respond. I was too busy negotiating oversight scope and remote clearance transfer clauses with my new employer. Because here's what Max never understood. People don't leave federal contracts, they graduate from them. And while he was polishing buzzwords for his LinkedIn fan club, I was already 3 steps into the next phase. The subcontractor didn't just want me. They wanted continuity, stability. The kind Max couldn't manufacture, buy, or fake. They knew my clearance was intact. They knew I already spoke the agency's language. They knew what it meant when a federal client walks out of a meeting behind a compliance officer without saying goodbye. Once the freeze hits payroll, my recruiter said, tapping her pen against the table, he'll figure it out. I nodded, not bothering to smile, because the freeze had already hit. And Max was now completely alone. The consultants had gone quiet. PR firm started distancing itself, asking if they should delay the transition success post. His own father hadn't returned his calls in 48 hours. The building wasn't just crumbling, it was quarantined, and the man holding the match, still too proud to realize his fingers were burning. At 6:17 a.m., the Gulfstream touched down on the tarmac in D.C., wheels squealing like the brakes were trying to warn him. Harold, the real CEO, one who'd built the company with nothing but a Rolodex, a bad temper, and an ironclad respect for federal red tape, checked his phone while the engines wound down. The lock screen bloomed with red, 10 missed calls, a string of increasingly panicked texts from legal, and one chilling subject line from procurement. Urgent, Client freeze personnel violation confirmed. He didn't bother waiting for the jet bridge. He read through the formal notice in the car, eyes narrowing with every line. The coffee his assistant handed him stayed untouched. When he reached the end, named officer, Karen Elizabeth Monroe clearance status, suspended pending internal review, he exhaled through his nose like a bull just before the gate opens. By 7:03 a.m., Max's phone rang. He didn't answer the first time, or the second. By the third, he picked up, breathless. "Hey, Dad, listen, there's a bit of a miscommunication happening with." "What the hell happened?" A long pause. Max cleared his throat. She was toxic. Old school, couldn't adapt to the new pace. Harold didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Our entire federal clearance was her, he said flatly. "Who the hell did you just fire?" Max didn't answer. Didn't need to. Harold already knew. He ended the call, walked straight into HQ, bypassed reception, and didn't say a word to the executives lining up like kids waiting to confess which face they broke. Back in my apartment, I poured myself another cup of Irish breakfast, folded yesterday's newspaper crossword in half, and watched the panic spill across LinkedIn in real time. First, the firm's public calendar went dark, meetings removed, visibility restricted. Then, a few sharp-eyed industry folks noticed the federal agency's name had quietly disappeared from the client list on the homepage. Then came the update from an anonymous industry blog. Top-tier Fed contractor under scrutiny after named officer removed without notification. The firm issued no statement, because there was nothing to say. They'd fired the one person who held the clearance, the relationships, and the keys to the audit trail. Now the guy who called me ballast was being called something far worse by his own board. Inside the building, Harold convened the emergency roundtable. Legal, pale and blinking too much. Finance, borderline hysterical, worried about cash flow gaps and the domino effect of a frozen quarter. Procurement, holding a printout of the original MSA with my name highlighted in 6 places. And Max? He tried to lean back, put on that smug grin. "I was trying to bring in new blood," he offered. "We needed to innovate. You needed to shut up and read," Harold snapped. "You fired the person whose name is the contract." Dead silence. HR tried to chime in with, "We followed offboarding protocols." Harold cut her off. "I don't care if you gave her a fruit basket. You let a 20-something consultant tell you to delete our federal standing like it was an outdated spreadsheet." He stood slowly, picked up the binder from procurement, and walked out of the room without another word. Meanwhile, I was just finishing my tea, phone buzzing silently on the table with a message from my lawyer. "They want to talk. I told them you're unavailable per your new contract." I turned the phone face down and opened the crossword, 5-letter word for consequence. I smiled. Flame. The first emergency meeting started at 9:00 a.m. on the dot. By 9:04, procurement looked like they'd aged 10 years, and legal was flipping through the MSA like it was a Bible during a thunderstorm. No pastries, no catered fruit, just sweat, finger-pointing, and a room full of executives who suddenly remembered what compliance actually meant. Harold sat at the head of the table, glasses off, elbows on the wood. He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, like someone had put a loaded shotgun in the middle of the table just to see who flinched first. Max tried to open with charm. Again. "We're actively identifying a new officer to maintain continuity," he said, slick as ever, voice like a bad sales pitch. "We've got leads on 2 candidates who," legal cut him off. Literally raised a hand. "We're not identifying anyone," she said, voice dry enough to choke someone. "We're reading the agreement." She flipped to section 4.1.3 of the Master Services Agreement. Loudly. "All compliance responsibilities related to data handling, federal audit response, security control validation, and milestone clearance shall remain under the authority of the named compliance officer, identified as Karen Elizabeth Monroe. This designation is non-transferable and must be authorized in writing by both parties and verified through current clearance records maintained by the issuing agency." No one breathed. Legal snapped the binder shut. "The client won't resume communication until she is either reinstated or someone with equivalent clearance is approved by them. Until then, all milestones, payments, and deliverables are frozen." Max opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "That language isn't binding," he said, panic leaking through his smile. "It's just legal scaffolding, there's wiggle room." Harold turned to him slowly. "Max," he said, voice like frost cracking over a lake, "the only wiggle here is you twisting in your chair while our contract dies on the table." Someone in finance muttered, "Jesus." By noon, Max was officially removed from all compliance conversations. Not reassigned, removed. No access to federal folders. No visibility on client comms. His Slack account was deactivated mid-sentence during a thread where he tried to brainstorm a recovery narrative. He left the building an hour later. No announcement, no farewell. Just a hoodie pulled over his head and a box of desk junk carried out like a sitcom extra who didn't make the final cut. That same afternoon, I got a call. Unknown number. I let it ring twice, then answered. "Karen Monroe? Yes, this is Robert from the agency. I'm calling to discuss a new position. Full oversight of the federal portfolio. Direct reporting to our internal governance board. You'll liaise independently with full autonomy." I didn't respond right away. He continued, "We'd consider it a strategic move. Your continuity, your documentation, your discretion hasn't gone unnoticed. That last part almost made me laugh, but I didn't. I said only what needed saying, send the terms. He did. 20 minutes later, the PDF landed in my inbox. It wasn't just a job. It was elevation. No politics, no middlemen, no Maxes with MBA certificates, and no understanding of what classified handling really required. Just me, a direct line, and the agency that already knew exactly what I brought to the table because I'd built the table. Harold sent a message too through my lawyer. 3 words, we made a mistake. I didn't reply, because silence, when it's earned, is louder than any gloat could ever be. Let them scramble. Let them chase signatures and clearance forms and audit logs like children picking up broken glass. I was done speaking. My name had already spoken enough. The fluorescent lights hummed low and steady, like they'd been waiting all morning just for me. I stepped through the glass doors of the agency's intake center, the kind of place that smelled like old carpet and ironclad authority. No front desk smiles. No receptionist on a headset pretending to be busy. Just a manila folder with my name printed in black and a security officer who checked my ID twice, then handed me a visitor's lanyard without a word. Down the hall, 3rd door on the left, the room was small, windowless, 1 table, 1 chair, and 1 man already seated, stoic as ever, his expression unreadable. Posture exactly like it was the last time I saw him, when he stood up in silence and followed me out of that boardroom. He nodded once. I nodded back. He slid the badge across the table. I picked it up, not rushed, not emotional, just correct. Like the final piece of a puzzle that had been hiding in plain sight under the couch of someone else's arrogance. Your clearance is reinstated under direct portfolio control, he said. No intermediary approval required. I'll route documentation through you going forward. I didn't smile. He didn't ask questions. I signed the line beneath the seal. Initialed the clause below it, yes, that one. The one Max didn't read, the one that made my name the lock and the key. When I stood to leave, he added, we'll issue transition guidance to the prior contractor. Already received the notice, I said softly. They just don't know it yet. Back at the firm, my former firm, the scene was colder. Harold sat alone in the war room, tie undone, staring at a printed copy of the agency's official freeze extension. No meetings, no payments, no access. Just a bold line at the bottom, we will reassess contract eligibility when personnel integrity has been restored. The phrase hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Personnel integrity. Not operational readiness, not scalability, integrity. One thing they'd fumbled while chasing metrics and gutting muscle for the sake of modernization. The firm's inboxes were silent. The contractors had gone dark. And Max was nowhere. Rumor was he'd left the country, personal leave, the statement said, though no one was buying it. A man who confused clearance with clout doesn't survive long in an industry where your reputation isn't just your currency, it's your license to operate. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed once. Message from my lawyer forwarding one last internal memo. Subject, urgent, strategic re-engagement planning. I didn't open it, didn't need to, because everything had already been said. In the logs they ignored, in the clauses they skimmed, in the badge now clipped quietly to my jacket. No vengeance, no press release, no dramatic email chains, just a quiet name on a line that meant everything, and a building full of people who finally realized what it meant too late. As I stepped back into the sunlight outside the agency, a gust of wind caught the edge of my coat. I tucked the badge beneath the lapel and kept walking. No destination. No grand plan, just a future where I'd never again have to explain what I'm worth to someone who thought power was louder than proof. The clearance stood, and so did I. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit him.